Welcome and good morning, everyone. And as I said yesterday, everyone that has a heart should be here. It's the number one killer in the world today is heart disease. But it hasn't always been the number one killer. It became the number one killer after the Industrial Revolution. So what happened in the Industrial Revolution? Well, a whole lot of different things did happen in the Industrial Revolution. And we're going to touch on those as we do our investigation of why heart disease is the number one killer. But first of all, I'd like to have a look, what's medicine doing to try and reduce this number one killer? Well, let's do an assessment of this, and through our assessment, we'll discover if it's working. Because what's the definition of insanity? To do what you've always done and expect different results. So it probably started about the 1970s, I think, that the theory came forth that it was fat that was causing heart disease. And so everyone was told to go fat-free or low-fat, is that right? And everyone was told to stop butter and start eating margarine, is that right? Well, did that reduce heart disease? Not at all. In fact, it's made absolutely no difference at all. But it made a difference in one area, and that is cancer has risen. And it's not the only reason cancer has risen. Another thing's risen, and that's Alzheimer's, dementia, because our brain is the fattiest organ in the body. Let's assess fat for a minute. And the cell, and we've been looking at the cell a few times this week, and we need to, because when you understand the inside workings of the cell, you begin to understand how the body works. The membrane around every cell is 50% fat. Whether you're 100 pound, 200 pound or 300 pound, we're talking about the membrane around the cell. So that makes fat pretty important, but not the brain cell. The brain cell is 70% fat. Tonight we're going to go to the brain. So let me just draw a little brain cell here. It's a little bit different to the other cells. It communicates with each other via little chemical messengers, and these little chemical messengers are picked up by these dendrites or the receiving stations. And yes, this membrane around that nerve cell is 50% fat, but this arm that comes out of the nerve cell adds another 20% fat. So the brain cell is actually 70% fat. So can you see that the low fat, the fat-free diet is actually a dangerous diet? And since the Industrial Revolution, since the development of high heat chemical equipment that can extract oil out of hard seeds and in the process actually totally damaging the oil, heart disease has risen. So before then, heart disease wasn't that much of an issue. You see, people are eating fat for thousands of years. And when Captain Cook landed on the South Pacific Islands, he was confronted with the most magnificent specimens of humanity he'd ever seen. The men were tall, strong, agile. The women were beautiful. In fact, Weston Price, he went through the islands in about the 1930s taking photographs. He's a dentist. Photographs of teeth, perfect teeth. Photograph of skeletons, perfect teeth, perfect jawlines. And guess what they ate every single meal? Coconut. Coconut cream or coconut milk or coconut oil. A white man came along and said, stop the coconut, it's going to give you heart disease, cancer, high blood pressure. And you know what they said? What's that? They've been eating it for thousands of years. So when I was in Fiji speaking to 5,000 people a few years ago, I had a huge hall, and then underneath there was another huge hall with a big screen with me on it. And at the end, after I'd spoken on basic health principles, question time. And the question came out, is coconut good or bad, coconut oil? What am I going to say to these 5,000 people? I said, were your ancestors healthy? Oh, they all nodded. Absolutely. We had the healthiest ancestors. And then I said, what did they eat every meal? There was a quiet, then a laugh here and there, and then 5,000 people started laughing. Because what a joke. Huh? What a joke. They've been told that what they're eating is bad, but they're the healthiest people on the planet. And you have a look at them now. Are they the healthiest people on the planet? They're one of the sickest. One of the sickest. They're huge. They're huge with the hot bread shops everywhere. Because white man brought in the 5 lethal whites. White rice, white flour, white sugar, white refined salt, white cow's milk, and those lethal whites are doing their job. We might not have a lot of letters behind our name, but you know what we've got? Common sense. And you know there's been a death. No one attended the funeral. No one knew he died. It was the death of common sense. No one even knows it's gone. It's common sense. And common sense can be strengthened and it can be weakened. You know what strengthens it? Use. Use. And my husband says about 2020 to about 23, if you're looking for common sense, you won't find any. He calls it the great pretend. So the fat-free diet is actually a dangerous diet because we need it. And we have looked in every lecture just about at the 3 essential food groups. What does essential mean? Body cannot function without it. It needs fibre to slowly release the nutrients, fibre to feed all the different microorganisms, fibre to sweep the gastrointestinal tract every day. It needs protein. 50% of the membrane around every cell in the body is protein. So that's pretty important. We looked at the legumes, the nuts, the seeds for protein, and the third essential nutrient. Now, did everyone get that? Essential. Can't live without it. Is fat. But there's fats and there's fats. But the non-essential food group, let's look at the non-essential. Being non-essential, it means we can live without it. Carbohydrates. And as we've looked at over the last few days, many people today are just overdoing it. Carbs aren't bad. It's only when they're overdone and refined. What fat does, it gives the feeling of satiation or satisfaction in the meal. And when people are on fat-free diets, they're never satisfied, so guess what they're doing all day long? Eating, eating, eating. And what's happening to them on the high-carb, high-sugar diet? They're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It makes no sense at all. And that's why I suggest that this theory is a very dangerous theory. And in his book, The Great Cholesterol Con, Dr. Malcolm Kendrick, cardiovascular surgeon, he said, I'm still waiting for the proof that fat causes heart disease. Because there is none. We've been spun a lie. It's actually a myth. But there are some oils that can contribute to heart disease, and that are those oils. You go to the supermarket and you'll see them straight away. They're all on special. They're the cheapest oils. They're in clear plastic bottles, and they are the oils that were extracted from the hard seeds. So that's the soy oil, the peanut oil, the sunflower oil, the safflower oil, the canola oil. Don't touch them. Don't touch them, because what they do is they damage the tissues. They're dangerous oils. That's why be careful where your dollar goes. If everyone stopped buying those oils, you know what they do? They put them on special even more. And then you know what had happened? Ads had come up on the television saying what wonderful oils these are. Have you noticed? I know who molds the minds of the people, the media. And when in 2020 it was illegal to have a protest, so my husband held one every 2 weeks. Shouldn't we all? When they tell you, because God's government is a government of freedom. That's not freedom. That's not freedom. In fact, when you're told no protest, it's time for us all to hold protests. Is that right? And when they say you have to do social distancing, that's the time for us to start hugging each other. Yes. My son Peter, he refused to wear a mask. Do you know what I found interesting? Was my children were homeschooled in a rainforest. They didn't have media. They weren't moulded in the system. And they're all away from me now. They're all living in cities and married and working. And when COVID hit, they saw straight through it because their minds hadn't been moulded in the mould. But Peter's a tiler, carpenter, and he has to go to Bunnings, which is like a big hardware shop, to get his equipment, things he tiles with. And you're not allowed in unless you've got a mask. I said, how do you get in? He said, I just march in as if I own the place. Built like this, no one crosses him. Gets his stuff, smiles, goes out. So what else? I trust I've proven to you that this is actually a scam. It's not true. And by the way, if our brain's 50% fat, this is also a contributing factor to the Alzheimer's we're seeing, because the brain cannot function without it. And the fattiest food on the planet with the highest cholesterol levels is breast milk. And no babies having heart attacks, because that developing brain must have fat. So number 2, they're putting everyone on cholesterol-lowering medication over the age of 50. Is that right? And if someone has a stroke or a heart attack, then there's a protocol. No matter who you are, no matter your age, no matter your size, no matter what came together to cause it, you're put on the same protocol. Is that right? But remember, when you go to the prince for their advice, you can say, thank you so much for your advice, or you might say, thank you so much for your opinion, because that's what it is. It's not written in concrete. Thank you so much for your advice. I'm going to seriously consider this. And you go home and you weigh up the pros and cons because you have time. Don't make a decision on fear, because fear is, in fact, I was at a retreat a few years ago and a lady had a T-shirt on every day and it said, fear is a liar. And I'm looking at this T-shirt every day. She ended up giving me one. So we'll call them the statin drugs because all the statin drugs are cholesterol-lowering medications. So let's have a look at cholesterol. The liver makes cholesterol, and it makes cholesterol according to the body's demands. Did you get that? If the body demands a lot of cholesterol, the body will make a lot of cholesterol. And it makes 2 different types of cholesterol. One is high-density lipoprotein, or HDL, and the other main type is low-density lipoprotein. And how the cholesterol is made in the liver, 80% of the cholesterol that the liver makes is made from glucose. And 20% of the cholesterol that the liver makes is made from fat. Just this information alone is enough to tell you it's not the butter on the bread, it's the bread under the butter. It's not the olive oil on the pasta, it's all that pasta underneath, especially if it's made out of wheat, especially if it's made out of the hybridized wheat, as we looked at yesterday. So what do HDL and LDL do? High-density lipoprotein is the carrier. What do I mean by carrier? It carries excess cholesterol back to the liver. Here's the liver. And so it's considered the good guy because it carries excess cholesterol back to the liver. LDL, considered the bad guy, but you know, the body doesn't make bad things. It has a purpose. And LDL's role in the body is that of a repairer and a rebuilder. So wherever you see the need for repair and rebuilding, you will find LDL. LDL does something else. It delivers cholesterol to the brain, and the brain loves cholesterol. In fact, that little fatty sheath around the myelin sheath is predominantly cholesterol. Dr. Malcolm Kendrick, he said for the first time, normal levels of a normal vital body substance is being called a disease, which of course is cholesterol. So let's look at the blood vessel and see how these two cholesterols work in the blood vessel. Here's the blood vessel. And because of its low density, LDL is always found on the edge. Because of its high density, HDL is always found in the middle. Let me relate some of the books that we have in our library at home. You won't catch them because I'll say them so fast, but they're all listed in my chapter on the heart in Sustain Me. Dr. Malcolm Kendrick, The Great Cholesterol Con. Dr. Peter Dingle, The Great Cholesterol Deception. Dr. Dwight Lundell, The Great Cholesterol Lie. The Great Cholesterol Hoax. Johnny Bowden, he's written The Great Cholesterol Myth. We're running out of words. And because we're running out of words, when Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride wrote her book, she called it Put Your Heart in Your Mouth. You see, it's not the cholesterol. Let me show you what cholesterol does. And in her book, Put Your Heart in Your Mouth, Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride, she spends the first 3 chapters listing all the environmental poisons that we are exposed to that get into the blood and damage the little endothelium cells that line the artery. And we've been touching on them this week in our food, in our cleaning products, in our laundry detergent, in our clothes. Most people were very surprised to know that polyester, nylon, acrylic, dangerous stuff. And whether it comes in through your skin, whether you eat it, whether you inhale it, it all gets into the blood. And when it's in those blood vessels, it's damaging the arterial wall, exposure to mold. Now, there was a question last night. A lady's been living in a moldy house and she had a stroke. She said, could it be the mold? It could be, because it gets into the blood and it damages the arterial wall. In my book, Self-Heal by Design, I do a history of mold and I look at the Bible. Do you know that if there was ever mold growing in the house, they had to clean the house, they had to pull all the mortar out of the stones, scrub it, re-mortar it, shut the house up, and if after 2 weeks they opened it and it was back again, the whole house had to be destroyed. In fact, it had to be dismantled and taken to an unclean place outside the city. Whoa, that's strong. So way back in Bible times, it was indicated that this is toxic stuff. If it's in the clothes have to be burnt. It's called leprosy in the house in the old King James Version, leprosy in the cloth, and then leprosy on the skin. Interesting. And you go to the New International Version and it calls it mildew in the house, mildew in the clothes, and infectious skin disease. But if you are going to interpret that, because it's the same word, what's the interpretation? Mildew on the skin. And if you look in the medical dictionary, myco is a prefix for many diseases. Myco means fungus. Leprosy is a fungus. So cigarettes, it is estimated there are about 7,000 chemicals in cigarettes today, And even medically, it's acknowledged that smoking increases the risk of heart disease and stroke. But it's the chemicals going in and damaging the lining of the artery. Okay, students, who's going to plug up the holes? LDL? It's already fat. It's LDL. The cholesterol comes in and there it is. I remember when I used to work in the operating theatre, we did a bypass one day and the artery that was cut out of the heart, and then you know what they do? They cut one out of the leg and then sew it in and sew the body up. But never talk to the patient about changing their lifestyle, changing their exposure to chemicals. Because, you know, if you ask them, why don't you? You know what they say? I'm a doctor. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not a... And by the way, the walls of the artery down here aren't as strong as the walls of the artery up here, because up here it's got the strongest force of blood. So how long's the one from down here going to take? And what happens to where it was? Oh, they just sew it up. Because they know we have an incredible body that does adapt and adjust. Isn't it incredible what some bodies have been through and they're still alive? But the people don't realise the damage. They don't realise, and the damage is continuing. So what's happening in the arterial wall? And when I was in the operating theatre and the operation had finished and the surgeon got the artery and he got tweezers and he pulled this white gristle out of the artery. And you know what they say? Cholesterol. This cholesterol's evil. But what should we be asking? Why is it there? Why is it there? Is that ever asked? Why is it there? Something else is happening. You can see that damage to the arterial walls, and yes, it's the Industrial Revolution when heart disease really started to become #1 killer. But can you see it just wasn't one thing? Yes, it's those damaging refined seed oils, they damage the arteries too. So that's another contributing factor to the damage. And with the Industrial Revolution, that's when the chemical fabrics, you see, nylon, acrylic, polyester, were created in a laboratory. They're chemicals. And how many ladies love them because you don't have to iron? Well, I'd rather iron than have this polyester that's killing me. The first cigarette doesn't cause doesn't cause lung cancer. It's not the odd day you do it or the odd day you don't. It's what you do every day. Little by little by little, it's having an effect. Something else is happening. We've got little protein molecules floating through our blood. And when someone's on a very high carbohydrate diet, we've looked at it a few times. And I've also talked about the fact that people seem to have taken all the carbohydrates from all over the world, put them all together, and they're eating all carbohydrates. But the fact is, the carbohydrate is a non-essential. And on that diet, people are missing out on the fibre, the protein and the fat, and they're overdoing the non-essential. The only way the body can cope with that is to store it as fat. But what's happening in the blood is that high glucose that gets into the blood, it starts to connect with these protein molecules and it becomes sticky. And it sticks on the side of the artery. And let's say we've got a very narrow part here and one of these ages, they're called, sticky substances comes down and blockage. If that happens in the carotid artery, that's a stroke. And if that happens in the heart, that's a cardiac arrest. Can you see it's not one thing that causes heart disease, strokes? It's a whole lot of bits and pieces. That's why you're the doctor. And we had a lady come to us from England. She's 47. She's the CEO of a big company. She'd recently had a stroke. And because she had a stroke, they gave her the protocol, statin drugs, high blood pressure medication, blood thinning medication, and she was taking it for one reason. Yep, fear. So I said to her, can you tell me the week before your heart attack? Can you tell me what you were eating and drinking and what you were doing? And she looked a little bit embarrassed, so I knew we had quite a story coming. Because, by the way, they did an angiogram on her and her arteries were clear. And yet, what had they put her on? Statin drugs. I said, tell me about the week before you had the stroke. She said, I had a deadline to keep. I was averaging 3 hours of sleep a night. I was hardly drinking water because I was just drinking lots of coffee. I was living on coffee and tea. You know what that's telling me? I've got a picture of the blood vessels getting constricted, of the blood in the blood vessels being quite thick. She said it was very stressful. She said I was getting a lot of pressure from my husband to come home, but she said I had to meet this deadline. I was getting pressure. That deadline had to be kept. So no sleep, high stress, not enough water. And you know what the body sometimes does? It stops you, doesn't it? That's why we got to listen. We've got to listen to this body. Because if you don't listen to the first whisper, the body will start screaming at you. And when it starts screaming, it's doing damage. And bang, she had a heart attack. So when she came to our retreat and she heard the basic principles of what I'm showing you here, she started to realize she did not need statin drugs. She did not need blood thinners. She did not need the high blood pressure medication. So what do the statin drugs do? The statin drugs block the pathway in the liver that the liver uses to make cholesterol. But that same pathway that it blocks to stop the body making cholesterol is the same pathway that makes coenzyme Q10. You've heard of coenzyme Q10? You know what coenzyme Q10 is? It's your heart protective enzyme. So someone can go on cholesterol-lowering medication to prevent a heart attack, but they can actually increase their risk. Gee. So she stopped immediately. And if you are on statin drugs, you can stop immediately. There will be a side effect, though. Your memory will return. Because the side effect of the statin drugs are Alzheimer's, dementia, memory loss, muscle wasting, and they've just added another one, breast cancer. Because as we saw on Tuesday, I think it was, our sex hormones are made from cholesterol. Put not your trust in princes, neither in the Son of Man, in whom there is no help. It doesn't mean you don't go to the princes. Some of my friends are doctors. I think most doctors are ethical, but the pharmaceutical company is not. It is not. And I believe most doctors put too much trust in the pharmaceutical company princes. And let me give you a little bit of a window into what the Bible says. And this is in Revelation. These are in the last days on the planet Earth, which I think we're just about living in. And in Revelation 18, it talks about Babylon is fallen, these false systems. And in verse 23, in chapter 18, it says, her merchants, who are merchants? Are they the salesmen? Her merchants were the great men of the earth. Who are the great men of the earth? The wealthiest. What's the wealthiest company in the world? Pharmaceutical. Her merchants were the great men of the earth, and by her sorceries were all nations deceived. That word sorcery comes from the Greek word pharmakia. Do you have pharmacies here? What do pharmacies sell? drugs. Is the whole world being deceived by these pharmaceuticals? Isn't that interesting? What the Bible says? I think that is so appropriate for today because so many people are taken in by it. So many. God is very good the way he teaches us. And one of the first verses that I keep, and I know it very well, it's Psalm 32 verse 8, where God says, I will instruct thee and teach thee in the way that thou shalt go. I will guide thee with mine eye. So I was at Living Springs Retreat 10 years ago, and there was a guest there. She was 69. She was a nutritionist. She said, I've been a nutritionist for 40 years. She said, so I have the advantage of being schooled 40 years ago in the university. She said 40 years ago we were taught that a cholesterol level of 300 was perfectly normal. Now, did everyone get that? What are you told today? You can't go over 190, is that right? And if you go over 190, what do they want to do? Put you on the statin drugs? No wonder Australia, I know the Australian figures, no wonder 1,700 cases of Alzheimer's is being diagnosed every week. How many people in aged care facilities have dementia, and a lot of it can be contributing to the fact that they're on the statin drugs, and they don't want to stop the statin drugs because of fear. 2 Timothy 1 verse 7, God said, I have not given you the spirit of fear, but of power. What's power? Isn't knowledge power? Love and a sound mind. A sound mind considers these things that I'm telling you. And if you might say to me, well, Barbara, who are you to say these things? I say, I'm a nobody. But if you go to my chapter, Love Your Heart with All Your Heart, in Sustain Me, I quote all the books from the experts, The Great Cholesterol Lie, The Great Cholesterol Con, The Great Cholesterol Deception, The Great Cholesterol Hoax, The Great Cholesterol Myth. Huh? They're written by the experts, so get the books and read it for yourself. I see myself as a journalist, just gathering the information and presenting it to you. They have the resources. But you know what we have? It's common sense. And so I was in Maryland last year, and I was talking to a lady who's in her late 70s. She said, I'm a pathologist. She said, I'm retired now, but I used to do all the pathology testing for cholesterol. I said, really? She said, we considered 350 perfectly okay. So you know what they've done? They've dropped the levels to what? 200? Okay, they've dropped the levels. Has that reduced heart disease and strokes? No, but you know what's increased? Alzheimer's, dementia, because our brain needs fat. Let me give you an illustration of someone it's a recipe for disaster, a recipe for brain problems, a recipe for Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, dementia, Alzheimer's. Someone being on a fat-free diet, got a mouthful of mercury fillings, having a flu injection every year that's got mercury in it, and they're on cholesterol-lowering medication. Yeah. And how many are? I gave this lecture in New Zealand about 5 years ago, Tuesday night. Thursday night, a man wanted to speak to me. He was in his 80s and he had his wife with him. She was just a little lady. She was just very quiet, sitting there. He said, I've got a story for you. He said, we're about to put my wife in an aged care facility. because her dementia was getting really bad. She was leaving the iron on. She'd leave the oven on. I'd wake up in the night and she'd be gone, and I'd go looking for her, and she's walking down the middle of the road with no clothes on. It's very difficult to nurse someone with dementia. He said, we didn't want to do it, but we were concerned for her safety. He said, we came to your lecture and we realised my wife's she's been on Lipitor for 10 years. He said, we stopped it immediately. He said, it's 48 hours now. He said, I've got my wife back. And he started to cry. Yeah. We don't need to put her in aged care anymore. Yeah. This is criminal. That's why education is power. That's why God said, I've not given you the spirit of fear, power, love, sound mind. A sound mind considers these things. In fact, I think if you've got a heart doctor, buy the Great Cholesterol Con. It's by a cardiovascular surgeon, and just say, tell me what you think of this book. Don't tell them to read it, because they probably won't. Tell me what you think of this book. That's all you say. We had a pharmacist attend our program. She was in her 50s. She said, I'm not against drugs. I'm a pharmacist. It's my job. But she said recently a circular came round that anyone with a cholesterol level over 190 had to go on cholesterol-lowering medication. She said, I'm annoyed. She said, it's just a money-making scheme. That's from the mouth of the pharmacist. She said, if someone goes on antibiotics, how long are they on that for? A week. Someone goes on cholesterol-lowering medication, how long are they told they're on it for? For life. That's why I believe God designed everyone to be their own doctor. Because only you know what you feel, only you know what you've been through, and it's your God-given right to say no thank you. Because this is my body, it's my God-given right, no thank you. One lady said, my pediatrician says if I don't do this, he won't see me anymore. I said, and what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? Can you clear these arteries out? Yes. Isn't that good news? Yes. Yes, you can clean them out. How can you clean them out? This might surprise you and it might not surprise you. I just have to clear this side of the board because of what I'm about to write. And I think I've written it before. The sustain me principles. That will do it. What about aspirin, Katia? How many people are put on that to keep the blood thin? In fact, one lady said, I can't stop the aspirin. I said, why not? She said, my doctor said I will die. He's not God. And by the way, if that lady continues not to drink water, continues to have 3 cups of coffee a day, it may be so. But let me give you the side effects of aspirin. Stomach bleeds is one of the #1 causes of stomach ulcer. Brain bleeds, here we've got a contributing factor to Alzheimer's, and eye bleeds, causing deterioration of eyesight. They're the side effects of aspirin. I know that the best blood thinner in the world is water. I used to do a live blood analysis at Misty Mountain Health Retreat, take a drop of blood, put it on the slide, look at it under the microscope, came up on the screen, and blood cells would be jumping around like this. But very occasionally, I'd look at the slide and the blood's clumped. And I would always presume I've spoiled the slide because it's easy to do that. 5 blood slides later, it looks like that. So I say to the person, have you had any water to drink today? And this was 3:00 in the afternoon, and it was an 18-year-old girl. She said, I don't drink water. I said, well, I can't look at your blood. It's so clumped. She didn't want to be at our health retreat. Her mother made her come. Her mother walked in the room, and her mother was 45. I said, let's look at your mother's blood. Mother's blood looked like this. I said, your mother's got better blood than you. I always find it interesting when I'm lecturing, and this girl was sitting there with her arms folded. Then she started to listen. The arms relaxed. She grabbed pen and paper, sat on the edge of a seat and started writing. And at the end of the week, she said, I wish this was the first day. See, knowledge. What made the difference was knowledge, information. And when I looked at her blood again, it looked like this. That's easy fixed. And that's how I know that the best blood thinner is water. But you can drink 8 glasses of water in the morning and be dehydrated by late afternoon. You got to spread it out. So a friend of mine, his name's David, he's a chiropractic doctor. Never drank, never smoked, plant-based diet, exercises every day. He's got Scottish ancestry, plays the bagpipe, so good lungs. He cycles sometimes 200K. He's early 60s, but he was getting breathless. So a friend of his who's a cardiologist suggested he have an angiogram where they put dye in and have a look at your arteries. And he had 80% occlusion of his main arteries. So that 80% would be probably what I've drawn here, 80% occlusion, 80% of the arteries are blocked. Whew. So he was rushed in and he had 2 bypasses, cutting out that artery and putting a new one in. I talked to him 3 days later. He said it was genetics, Barb. I said, genetics loads the gun, Dave. Lifestyle pulls the trigger. He said. Anyway, a couple of weeks later, he booked in and did our program. So I'm investigating. I want to know why this man who is so healthy, eats so well, has blockage in the arteries. So I said, tell me about your childhood, David. He said, well, both my parents were chain smokers. Aha. So here's David's arteries, and he's breathing in this passive toxic smoke. Now, this is in the 50s, 60s, where people just smoked everywhere. They smoked in restaurants, in bedrooms, in houses, and this little boy's breathing in this toxic smoke from the cigarettes, so he's getting damaged. I wouldn't be surprised if by the age of 15, he had maybe 15 or 20% build-up on his arteries. And he told me that in 2010, he wanted to put on muscle. He's like many vegetarians who eat too many carbohydrates, not enough protein, not enough legumes. So pasta, cereal, cakes, biscuits, he loved sugar sweet biscuits. So just too many carbohydrates. He wasn't overweight because he was so fit. He said, but he knew he needed muscle, so he started to eat tuna every day. We had a tuna fisherman do our program. He said, we catch 10-foot tuna. Mercury is bioaccumulative. So it'll be, and by the way, it will never be in salt because it's a heavy metal. Sinks to the bottom of the sea. The seaweeds take it up. The little fish eat the seaweed. The bigger fish eat the little fish. And then the great big, but it gets to the tuna, you've got a huge accumulation of mercury. I was talking to an ex-health minister in the Australian government. He said, when I was health minister, we made a rule you could not sell for fish, any fish over 1 metre long because there's too much mercury in it. See, mercury's bioaccumulative, it accumulates. So after 10 months of being on tuna every day, he he showed symptoms of mercury poisoning. Aha. And by the way, what's happening in the artery? What's the mercury doing? Further damage. So this explains so much to me as to why his arteries were blocking. And because he was on such a high carbohydrate diet, these little ages, these little combinations of glucose and protein are sticking on the wall. And so they cut the artery out. And yet how many people would say, what's the point of exercising? What's the point of going on a plant-based diet, stopping smoking and drinking? Look at him. But there's always a reason. Proverbs 26 verse 2 says, the curse causeless shall not come. In other words, no problem happens without a cause. There is always a cause. And what I did with David, his doctor hadn't done. What was blamed? Genetics. But you know what they're applying to genetics today? 5%. So sorry, you can't blame your genes anymore. So how do you clear them out and be cleared out? They can be cleared out. So I'll tell you a story. Dr. Agatha Thrash and her husband, Dr. Calvin Thrash, they started a health retreat called Uchee Pines. It's in Georgia. And they started it, I think it was in about the 80s. They've both passed now, but the retreat still runs. And she used to tell the story of a lady that came to them. This was, 25 years ago. And she was an alcoholic. And she'd had an angiogram and she had 80% occlusion of her arteries, but because she was 75 and because her body was in such a poorly way because of her alcoholism, they didn't want to do a bypass because it's a major, major operation. They have to saw the bones open them like this. Yeah, it's major. Choose your hard. So her family didn't want to lose her, but they were worried for her, so they paid for her to go to the health retreat. And the first 24 hours was very difficult for her. She'd been a smoker for a long time, daily alcohol. She was used to having coffee. But the 2 days on juices and the steam baths and the tender staff eased her through those difficult days. And by Wednesday, she was feeling very good. Her mind became clear. She started to have energy. And on the 4th day, in her room was a Bible. She opened the Bible. She started to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and she fell in love with Jesus. And she surrendered her heart to God. At the end of the week, she said to Agatha, do I have to go home? She said, this has just been an eye-opening week for me in many, many ways. And I'm so glad I serve a loving God now who's forgiven me for beating up my body so badly. So Agatha found a little room for her and she helped in the laundry and she kept walking every day, basically doing the Sustain Me principles, making sure she's getting daily sunshine. She began to actually like water. She used to hate water. But when she stopped drinking the coffee and the alcohol, she started to get a taste for it. She started to go to bed early every night, and she learnt to trust in God. All of the things that had damaged her, she'd eliminated from her diet. She learned to inhale through her nose. She was having a plant-based diet, high in fiber, great proteins, great fats. She learned that there are some great things in the plant-based diet, but to do them in moderation. Started eating her main meal, breakfast and lunch. It's a beautiful property, so it was easy to exercise and walk every day. So she very much enjoyed the next 10 months. And then she was found in her room and she'd passed away. She was late 70s. So Agatha, as a medical doctor, did a post-mortem on her. And she looked at her arteries, and her arteries were clear. Now, it's not often that you'll get such evidence, because someone might have an angiogram, 80% occlusion, and most people don't want to go back and have that radioactive dye put into their arteries just to find out if they're clear. But you will know if they're clear because you'll breathe easier. When you've got 80% occlusion, you haven't got a lot of blood going through, and the blood is the carrier of the oxygen. But something else about oxygen and what it does to the blood, which is why nose breathing is so important. In the lungs, and I'll just draw one here, the trachea splits and it goes into all these little bronchioles. This is what our lungs look like. Looks like almost a tree with lots of branches. At the end of every bronchiole, there's a little bunch of, looks like a bunch of grapes. Let me magnify it for you. They're called the alveoli, and it's the alveoli where the gaseous exchange takes place. And so there's a little blood vessel over every alveoli. When we nose breathe, yes, it purifies the air. Yes, it warms the air. Yes, it humidifies the air. Yes, it pressurizes the air, perfect for our lungs, but it does something else. And I mentioned this earlier in the week, but I'd like to explore it now. It balances blood gases. So what are the blood gases? One blood gas, of course, is oxygen. Another blood gas is carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is the waste from the combustion of glucose and oxygen in the cell. Combusting that gives off carbon dioxide. The other blood gas is nitric oxide. And what nose breathing does is it balances them. So how does this play a role in heart disease? Before I tell you exactly what it does, let me show you how these play together. And as I also mentioned this week, we have 75 trillion of these cells here. And the other 25 trillion are your red blood cells. And remember, the red blood cells are the carriers of oxygen, carriers of nutrients, carriers of water to the cell. In those 25 trillion cells that run like this, taking the oxygen and the nutrients to here, they're dependent on the blood, but they're dependent on us, making sure we've got enough oxygen, making sure we're putting nourishing food in there, and making sure we're drinking adequate water. And of those 25 trillion red blood cells, on each one, there's 270 million hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the carrier of oxygen, and each hemoglobin has 4 docking sites for oxygen. But there's a transfer. So the only way the hemoglobin can pick up 4 molecules of oxygen is if there are 4 molecules of carbon dioxide. It's a transfer. And if you breathe out through your mouth, you lose too much carbon dioxide. So you might only have 2 molecules of carbon dioxide, which means only 2 molecules of oxygen can be picked up. And that's why breathing in and out through the nose is vital to allow those little canals at the back of the nose to balance carbon dioxide and oxygen levels. So when I was running along the beach this morning, I started breathing very heavily. I don't think I was supposed to be there because it was all shut up, but I thought I'd just say to them, I'm in Australia, I'm used to running along the beach. It was black, it was night. I'm glad for the full moon. And we discovered that's the only time you can drive in Jupiter without traffic everywhere. I think it was 6 a.m. I breathed I wanted to open my mouth, but I do not let my mouth open because I want to maintain carbon dioxide and oxygen levels. Because the more carbon dioxide, the more oxygen you can pick up. And then when the blood comes to the wall of the cell, same process happens. 4 molecules of carbon dioxide coming out will allow 4 molecules of oxygen to come in. But if only 2 molecules of carbon dioxide come out, only 2 molecules of oxygen can come in. That's why we must breathe in and out through our noses. When you breathe in and out through your noses, you get more oxygen. And what puzzled the researchers is that the muscles we use in exercise, so when you're squatting, when you're running, your quads, your calf muscles, they found that they were picking up more oxygen than other cells. And the reason they picked up more oxygen is because they were giving off more carbon dioxide. And remember what we looked at the other day, that cycle that uses oxygen gives 18 times more energy compared to the cell that doesn't have the oxygen. Oxygen is the most vital element needed for life. But the reason carbon dioxide is so important is that it's a vasodilator. What's a vasodilator? Opens blood vessels. So vasodilation is vital when you're looking at controlling high blood pressure, when you're looking at protecting against heart disease or stroke. Vasodilation, dilation means open. So let's list some vasodilators. So vasodilators, carbon dioxide is a vasodilator. And if you breathe out through your mouth, you lose too much carbon dioxide. So if you find someone having a heart attack, get them to say it nicely. Can you please close your mouth? Breathe in and out through your nose. And when you breathe in and out through your nose, it causes a release of nitric oxide. When you breathe through your mouth, no nitric oxide. When you breathe in and out through your mouth, you lose too much carbon dioxide. It's nose breathing. No wonder Genesis 2 verse 7, God said that he formed man from the dust of the ground, breathed into his nostrils. Do you know the Bible says every word of the Lord is pure. Every single word has meaning in that Bible. Nostrils. Not mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Nostrils. Nostrils. Nose breathing. Nitric oxide is a vasodilator. So just breathing in and out through your mouth causes those blood vessels to open. Another vasodilator is cayenne pepper. In the book Back to Eden by Jethro Kloss, he devotes half a page to every herb except for cayenne pepper. He devotes 10 pages to cayenne pepper. He quotes 2 doctors in his article on cayenne pepper. One says it's impossible to abuse cayenne pepper. The other doctor said it will never cause a lesion. In other words, it'll never cause a burn. Do you know what that means? You could take a bucket of cayenne pepper a day and it won't hurt you, but I don't know anyone that does that. So if someone says to me, is it safe? Do you ask the doctor if the statin drugs are safe? They are not safe. Do you ask if the aspirin's safe? It is not safe. Now, the reason they say it's safe is because the pharmaceutical companies say it's safe, but they don't tell the truth. They don't tell the truth. Sorry to say this, but they don't. And you know what they're interested in? Your money, that's all. What about the different heat units of cayenne pepper? Well, the higher the heat unit, the less you have to take. It's as simple as that. There's no need to take rat poison, warfarin. And you know that's what it is. It causes rats to bleed to death. I met one man and he said, my nose is bleeding every day. Every time my arm touches anything, I've got bruises all over me. I said, well, I can't tell you what to do with your medication, but I can tell you what I do, and I probably don't have to tell you what I do. I would stop it, and I would go immediately on cayenne pepper and probably take 2 capsules 3 times a day. Take it with your meal. It'll help your digestion as well. Because remember what the good doctor said in Jethro Kloss's book, it's impossible to abuse it. It will never hurt you. You could take a bucket a day, but our palate tells us not to do that. Cayenne pepper. Cayenne pepper thins the blood. Cayenne pepper causes vasodilation, opening of the blood vessels, and cayenne pepper strengthens and heals the arterial walls. Wow, what a powerful herb. So this 75-year-old lady, alcoholic. So why did she die? Well, Agatha found that she had an embolism in her brain that had burst. Her arteries were so weak from 40 years of alcoholism. But she died with a smile on her face because she did not fear death. She knew that the best was yet to come, and she was so happy that in this life she'd finally seen the truth. And we serve a very forgiving Saviour. He knows the deception. He knows the deception. What's deception? Not as it seems. And I know I've had many people say to me, I was deceived into taking that shot. But the good news is we live in an incredible body, and it is a very forgiving body. And once you start giving it the right conditions, it can turn around. So looking at what medicine's done, they've tried the fat-free diet, didn't work. They tried the statins, didn't work. They tried to put everyone over the age of 50 on aspirin, didn't work. And what's the definition of insanity? To do what you've always done and expect different results. So we have seen many people freed. And isn't that what Jesus said? The first thing he read when he was asked to read at the age of 30, that's when he began his ministry. You'll find it in Luke chapter 4:18. He said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives. You know, there are many that are in captive to their medication, to their lifestyle, to their addictions. He came to set the captives free, to preach deliverance to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind. Do you find this week that your blindness has gone? To set at liberty or to set at freedom those that are bruised. That is God's message, freedom. It's a message of freedom. And that's what God's government is based on. God's government is a government of freedom. I trust that you will be able to now do what Proverbs 4:23 says. It says, keep the heart with all diligence, because out of it are the issues of life. What are the issues of life? That's what it pumps. It pumps the blood, and the blood is the life of the flesh, the carrier of oxygen, the carrier of water, the carrier of nutrients, the taking away of the waste. In fact, if you're sick, all you need is blood. Isn't that true? We could take the Beatles song, that's all you need is love, and just change it to blood. But we need to make sure we're taking in enough oxygen so that that blood is carrying good oxygen, that we're eating nourishing food so that the nutrients that the blood carries has got peak nutrients for our cells, that we're drinking adequate water so that the the blood can carry that water. And I trust I've already explained to you enough that salt is not a problem. So in my next lecture, after the break, I'm going to explain in detail why salt is not a problem. So with that, let us have a break and we return at 11:30. Thank you.